Welcome to Native Bidaské, Native News Online's weekly spotlight on the people making news and leading change in Indian country.
Welcome to another edition of Native Bidaské. I'm your host, Levi Rickert. The Lumbee Nation was recognized through a legislative bill this week, and the president will sign it very soon. And the Lumbee Nation, after I think first starting recognition process way back in 1888, finally will be a federally recognized tribe. And we have with us today Julian Brave NoiseCat, who is his book that came out in October. And welcome back, Julian. That you were on Native Bidaské back in October when your book came out. We survived the night, and hope that book tour went well. But in the book, you have a chapter called Lost Colonists, and that really deals with the whole process of the Lumbee Nation. So we want to talk to you about that and get your insights. And first of all, tell us how your book tour went.
It's been going great. Yeah, I got the opportunity to travel to, I think it was over 15 different cities across Canada and the United States. Really grateful to my publishers, Knopf and Random House Canada, for supporting me making it to all these different places to share my work with readers, especially at a time when reading and the arts are having a tough go of it. So I feel really grateful to do this work, and also grateful to be back in conversation with you, Levi.
Yes, it's good to see you. And hey, you actually went down and spent time in Pembroke, and Pembroke is the capital city of Lumbee Nation and Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina. I've actually been down there several times, and I will say this: I consider several Lumbee members personal friends, and they are very excited. I talked to them this week, and just tell me what your thoughts are, given the fact that once the president signs it, they will be a federally recognized tribe, the 575th tribe.
Yeah, it's a historic moment, and I think one that gets at not just, questions of who does and doesn't count as Indigenous, which I think is, top of mind for Indian country. But I think the Lumbee story actually gets more deeply at the history of this continent of America in a really significant way. The Lumbee tribe traces their origins. Their ancestors include the lost colonists of Roanoke, which is why I called my chapter about the Lumbee tribe Lost Colonists. And they are a tribe whose history is interesting and somewhat unique. Over the last 400 years of colonization, they assimilated various tribes and non-native people, white people and black people, into a tribal identity that became the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. And the way that laws have been written to decide who does and does not count as native preclude our ability, at least the American legal system's ability up until this point, ability to see that as being a possibility, even though that happened with great frequency across history. There were many examples of non-native people not choosing to become white, but instead actually choosing to throw in their lot with us, with natives. And I think that it's high time that the Lumbee were recognized as a tribe. They've been, fighting for tribal recognition for nearly 140 years. Some might even say they've been doing it in various ways before that. And, I think that it's also a testament to the power of tribes in the American political system. On both sides of this issue, very interestingly, in favor of Lumbee recognition, obviously there's the Lumbee tribe that has finally won their fight for recognition from Donald Trump, no less, which I think is a very interesting part of the story. And also on the opposition to Lumbee recognition, the primary voices against it were actually other tribes, the Eastern Band of Cherokee. And so no matter how you look at this story, I think that you have to grapple with the power of tribes in the American political system, which is not often how the story is told. Our people are often positioned as victims of American history. And in this story, we're protagonists and arguably also antagonists.
Well, what drew you to actually focus in on the Lumbee tribe for your book initially?
Well, I really do feel that there's such a prism into not just indigeneity, but into America as a whole. You know, as I mentioned, they include the lost colonists of Roanoke, the first
Mhm.
English settlement in North America, among their very diverse ancestors, which I think is a really fascinating part of their story. You know, their tribal hero is a figure named Henry Berry Lowry, who led a multiracial guerrilla campaign during the Civil War and Reconstruction against the white power structure in the American South. He was like a true folk hero. They wrote about him in like Harper's Weekly and all the national newspapers at the time. And yet, at the same time as they have that kind of a history, and they have this history of, you know, non-native people assimilating into their tribal identity, um, at the same time as that, you know, they compromised with the white power structure at various moments in their history, including, you could argue, you know, in the present one. In the sort of onset of Jim Crow, they compromised with the Southern Dixiecrats in the 1800s to get their own separate tribal institutions, and then, you know, now they voted for Obama in 2012, and then in 2016, you know, they switched sides to Trump, and it turns out that strategic vote for Donald Trump helped them, you know, secure federal recognition. Trump went down to Robeson County when he was campaigning and promised them that he would recognize them as a tribe, something they've wanted for, you know, 140 years or so. And you know, now Trump and the Republican Party has delivered with the passage of the National Defense Authorization Act. And you know, I think that is a prism into so many facets of Native life and American life more broadly. You know, who does and does not get to count as Native, what assimilation means, what race means in this country, and also the way that these things interact with our political system, which, you know, is not necessarily the way that they tell it straightforwardly, you know, on the street. You know, this is a story of people who fought back and compromised, and then eventually won what they'd been seeking for. And, you know, arguably, I mean, who could predict that a significant tribal victory, one that was being fought for, you know, over 100 years, coming up on 150 years, would happen under Donald Trump of all presidents? You know, I mean, I think that this stuff gives unique insights into the whole thing, this whole country, whatever the American project is.
Yeah, and I guess I'm gonna. You went down there, and as I mentioned, I have been down at Pembroke, and I was impressed with the influence they had in that town. As I recall, the mayor was Lumbee, the fire department chief was Lumbee, police chief was Lumbee, and of course they've had a great influence at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, and that they actually have a pretty big political block down there. And then uh, when you went down there, what did it really do in terms of you, Julian, experiencing or understanding better what it really means to be Native American? I know you touched on it a little bit, but if you could dig a little deeper, and you know, I think that's always the question: who really is Native American is out there right now, and you got people fact checking, right? Or and I've heard somebody
You
even
got
check
investigators now, yeah.
made sure that I'm a card carrying citizen of the Prairie Band.
I
So I
know.
mean, and that's okay. That's okay because you know some of us look more native than others, and you know, and I guess this is the richness of who we are as Native people. You go to like the National Congress of American Indians, you'll see blonde, blue-eyed Native Americans. You see African American looking Native Americans. Then you see the Great Plains looking with the braids. Mo brings plenties at some of the conferences.
Mhm.
But you know, what was your experience down there? What did you really, in terms of Native identity discover?
Yeah, you know, my people are from the West Coast, you know, and we didn't meet our first white man until 1808, so pretty late. But I went to school on the East Coast, and I think that, you know, that was an introduction to a part of Indian country that is, you know, has dealt with a history now over 400 plus years of colonization. And so, you know, on the Eastern Seaboard, natives look a lot more mixed often, because their history is a lot longer with, colonization and contact and intermarriage with, Black enslaved and freed people and all that sort of a thing. And I think that that's a really beautiful part of Indian country story, one that, I think sometimes from other tribes and nations, particularly to the West, there can be a little bit of a bias against, because, we look at some of these folks and we're like, well, they don't look, Indian, whatever that's supposed to really mean. But, I think that the Lumbees still carry, in my experience with them, a lot of the spirit of what I understand it to be Native. When they meet each other, the first questions they ask, if they're both Lumbee, is, who's your people? And where do you church? Which is to say that they ascertain who their kith and kin is, who is Lumbee, by understanding how they're related and what their place of prayer of worship is, which, to me, I mean, obviously, Christianity was something that was imposed upon our people from outside. But, my family's Catholic, so that is also something that has been, incorporated into a lot of our ways. And, I find that way of understanding who is Native, who your relatives are, where you're from, what your ways are. I find that to be a more truthful way at getting at, whatever the complicated thing is that is indigeneity, than, some sort of racial purity test, which, by the way, the Lumbee and many other tribes have been subjected to those kinds of tests at many times throughout their history. In fact, in the 1920s, 1930s, the Department of the Interior sent a physical anthropologist down to North Carolina to ascertain the blood purity of the Lumbees as natives, because, us Indians are supposed to have like shovel-shaped incisors and all kinds of, crazy ideas like that. And, just to give you a sense of how wonky that whole process was, that study found full siblings, wherein one sibling would be determined to be like Native or partially Native, and the other would be determined to be like not Native. So, I think that when we rely on these outside metrics, which, is we end up having to do because of the history of colonization to determine who does and doesn't count. We get into kind of shaky ground. And I think that our own people, our own communities have long had our own ways of determining who is and is not part of, us, our nations.
Yeah, I think that's it gets into a really deep discussion, and you get into blood quantum and all that. And if some tribes don't deal with the issue of blood quantum, there may not be tribes in 30, 40 years because of
And
the
that's a really important point, Levi. I think it's always important to remember that these laws were set up to make less natives, less Indians over time. That was the intention of colonization, and they are still set up to do that. And so, at the same time as there's a really important conversation happening about, pretendians, people who are not native, who claim to be native across, North America. At the same time as that is happening, we also have to acknowledge that there are a lot of people who are native, in fact, entire nations and tribes that are native, that are not recognized as such by the federal government. And so we have both issues. We have the issue of people claiming to be native to get the benefits, or because they heard a story that they never really fact checked. And then on the other side, we have tribes like the Lumbee, the largest tribe east of the Mississippi by population, who have been fighting to be recognized as native for over 140 years. I mean, I don't know. It's hard for me to see that and be like, well, they're fake. And, who at various moments in their history have been recognized by other Native people as being Native. A really telling story to me, at least, that I discovered when I was writing the chapter in my book about the Lumbee, is that there's a Lumbee drum group that travels the powwow circuit, and I'm a powwow dancer, and I've run into them some places. They're called War Paint. They're a really rocking drum group, honestly. They're really good. They've hosted powwows all across Indian country, including the Eastern Band of Cherokees annual 4th of July celebration, which to me, I'm like, this was my sort of take on this when I wrote about it. I was like, well, so they're not Native enough to share in our tribal identity, but they're Native enough to host your annual celebration. At a certain point, you kind of got to give me a break.
Yeah, and I think it's every once in a while, some of our readers want me to get involved, and I very delicately tell them I'm not anybody's enrollment office, nor do I want to be. That's all tribal, and let the powers that be decide that. With this Lumbee. Now, you said you were a dancer, and I read your book. And um, tell me about some of the Lumbee dancers that you know. I mean, you mentioned it in your chapter. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, in my chapter, I write about this guy Kea Little Turtle, who's the lead singer for Warpaint. He's sung with some of the greats. If you know the powwow circuit, you've heard of like Midnight Express, for example, from the Twin Cities. One of the greatest drum groups of all time. I liken them to like the Wu-Tang of powwow because their singers rarely get together now. They kind of all have their own different drum groups, but they're always considered a classic. And whenever I see them still out there singing, hosting at a powwow. They hosted the Muckleshoot. I think it was the sobriety powwow a couple summers ago. And,
No.
I had to be there because it's not often that you get to dance to Midnight Express these days. And so he's a dancer and a singer. And there's a whole bunch of other ones who you'll run into out there on the powwow circuit. I went to school on the East Coast, so I would go to some of the powwows out there. There's a guy named Kevin Chavis who I remember. Just a whole bunch of different folks. And they also, I've never been to it, but they have their own powwow down in North Carolina. They're like a spring powwow. And it's a pretty big one on the East Coast. So, they're a pretty significant force and presence in Indian country. It's also worth pointing out that there are Lumbee, Indian law attorneys and all sorts of different folks who have done work, not just for the Lumbee, but for tribes all over, the United States. In that chapter, I also write about a woman named Arlinda Locklear, who's, probably one of the most accomplished Native attorneys in the history of Indian country. She was, I think, according to some, the first Native woman to try a case in front of the Supreme Court. And she, even when she was in law school, she defeated John Kerry in a moot court competition. Like, this woman is a powerhouse, and she's worked on behalf of tribes all across Indian country. And, the real tragedy of that story is that some of the very same tribes that she fought for in the courts, would then turn around and sign petitions against Lumbee recognition. So, I think a big part of the story now, if we take seriously the notion that this ultimately was a story about, the Lumbees fighting for their recognition and some tribes, standing against it, a big question now, I think, facing Indian country is how we reconcile, that kind of a history, how we figure out how to get along, because the truth of the matter is that the federal government, usually sets policies towards Native nations, towards all the nations, and to a certain extent, despite our tribal differences, which are vast and many, and some of our peoples, have a long history of feuds and even wars and that sort of thing. We are all in this together also at the same time to a certain extent. And I think we're going to have to figure out how to work together, despite these challenging antagonisms that do exist across our communities.
Yeah, you bring up an excellent point, because when I go to conferences, I get approached by people from various differing views, and think I'm siding one way or the other. And I try to be very objective, but I do feel like it's a time to healing. And those who thought that sovereignty was in question, we just have to go with it at this point. They are federally recognized, and I don't think that's going to diminish anyone's sovereignty at this point. So,
And
sovereignty is what you make of it. You have to embrace it and make it work for you. So that's my point.
And regardless of whether you feel that the Lumbees are truly Native or not, I have my own view on this based upon now significant reporting and work on their history, research, all that sort of thing. I think you do have to recognize that they are very savvy political actors. Yeah. They have figured out how to get themselves recognized as a tribe, something they've been working at for 140 years. And if you're telling me that that's not a strong ally, then I don't know what to tell you, man. Like, you might not know up from down in politics.
Well, we're out of time, Julian, and we really appreciate you, and hope you have a nice holiday season. And thank you for coming to Native Bidaské. We'll see you soon.
Yeah, it's always good to talk to you, Levi, and all the best. Happy holidays, and hopefully we get to talk again in 2026.
Yes. To our viewers, Chi Miigwech for tuning in to another edition of Native Bidaské. And we're in the holiday season. However you celebrate Christmas, you may or may not celebrate it, but hey, give your families a lot of love this time. It's a season of giving, regardless of what you practice, what religion you practice. But it is a season of giving, and elders, take care of those young ones. Young ones, give those elders hugs. We're all in this together. We will get it done. We're looking forward to a positive, productive 2026. See you next week.
Thank you for joining us. If you value our warrior journalism for Indian country, please consider supporting our work by scanning the QR code or visiting the link below. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media, and sign up for our free daily newsletter. Chimigwech.